She'd been at the church potluck an hour earlier, smiling, ladling soup, holding someone's baby like nothing was wrong. By nightfall, she was in county holding, confessing to felony burglary with the calm of a woman reporting a broken fence. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She asked for water for the dog. And when they brought him in, he sat by her feet like it was just another mission. Because, in a way, it was. No one could yet know that a quiet woman's confession would unearth cases buried deeper than the gravestones above them. No one had any idea Ruth had pulled people from houses, trailers, cars, churches, and, more than once, from cages. No one could imagine she never asked for credit, never wanted praise, only silence, and space to disappear. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with a pie crust, and in towns like Willow Creek, Iowa, that was about as serious as Sunday morning prayers. Ruth MacNelly, who most folks in the county simply called Miss Ruth, had a way with dough that made the widowed farmers mumble thanks to long-gone wives, and the ladies at the church bake sale quietly compare their lattice work with bitter smiles they'd never dare show. Every Tuesday morning, just as the sun dragged its golden fingers across the frost-laced grass, Ruth would wake before the rooster, roll up her sleeves with that same quiet grace she used to fold in books, and set about preparing 3 pies, one for the library, one for the church pantry, and one for her neighbor Mr. Hensley, who lost his wife to cancer back in '09 and still hadn't figured out how to cook rice without boiling it into wallpaper paste. Her routine had been carved into the calendar of that little town, worn smooth by years of repetition and kindness, so much so that no one ever stopped to ask where Ruth came from, or why she lived alone with only her aging German shepherd, Ben, whose black snout had grayed like a storm cloud rolling off the prairie. Ben had a soldier's poise and a judge's eyes, always watching, always weighing people without ever barking judgment, and the children adored him even when they didn't quite understand why he never played fetch, because Ben didn't play. Not since something old in him had turned inward and stayed there. Ruth lived in a white clapboard house 2 blocks from the grain silo, where the mailbox leaned like a tired shoulder and the flag never rose, because she never received letters, just small notes from folks leaving empty pie tins, sometimes with a thank you, sometimes with a flower, and once with a silver coin that she quietly returned without a word. On that particular Tuesday in late September, with the cornfields dying into a sea of rust and wind, Ruth finished the apple cinnamon pie early, sprinkled a line of sugar along the crust with a surgeon's precision, and stood still for a long time at the kitchen window, watching a car idle in front of her house that didn't belong to anyone in town. The engine ran for 13 minutes, and when it finally drove away, Ben got up from his rug with a low growl in his chest, not the sound of danger, but the heavy vibration of recognition, like a war drum sounding from deep in the woods of memory. That night, her granddaughter Haley came by in a rush, cheeks pale, fingers trembling as she dropped her backpack by the door, mumbling something about her boyfriend needing money, about a mix-up at the pharmacy, about surveillance cameras and a friend who panicked and screamed too loud. Ruth didn't ask many questions, just led her to the kitchen, poured her a glass of cold milk, and cut a slice of the pie that hadn't made it to Mr. Hensley's table. They sat there in silence, the kind that says more than sermons, and Ruth looked at her granddaughter the way farmers watch the sky before a storm, not with fear, but with understanding. She asked one question, and only one. Did anyone see your face? When Haley didn't answer, Ben stood and walked over to her, sniffed her hands, and then let out a soft, guttural sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a whimper, but had weight to it, like a door closing in an old house. That night, Ruth took a walk she hadn't taken in 10 years, past the hardware store with the flickering neon sign, past the diner where nobody remembered the cook's name, past the corner where she used to light a cigarette back when she was someone else entirely. At exactly 9:17 p.m., Ruth MacNelly walked into the Willow Creek Sheriff's Station, looked the young desk deputy square in the eyes, and said in a voice that didn't shake, "I committed the robbery at Grant's Pharmacy earlier this afternoon. I used the back entrance, bypassed the silent alarm, and I took $362 in unmarked bills." The deputy blinked, reached for a form, and said something about needing to check the cameras. Ruth just nodded, handed over a folded paper with a crude map of the pharmacy's security layout, and added, "I suggest you talk to Sergeant Emmett. He'll remember a break-in from 1989 that looked awfully familiar." Ben sat beside her the whole time, calm as stone, eyes fixed on the door like he was waiting for someone who might never arrive. As they led her to the back room for questioning, the sheriff himself came downstairs in slippers, coffee in hand, and when he saw who was being booked, he stopped mid-step and whispered to no one in particular, "What the hell is Ruth MacNelly doing in my jail?" And back at the house, with the pie tin still on the table and the milk glass half full, Haley stared at the front door like it might open again. She whispered aloud, "Why would she do that?" "Because she's done it before," the sheriff said again, a little louder this time, though his voice had the weary tone of a man speaking more to memory than to anyone standing in the room. The young deputy, who'd never seen Miss Ruth without an apron or a church bulletin in her hand, looked at his boss like a child hearing that Santa Claus once robbed a train. Sheriff Eli Walker, now in his early 70s with joints that stiffened like rusty fence hinges in the cold, stared at the floor for a moment, then slowly turned to the officer beside him and said, "Get me the archive keys, the old room in the basement. Yes, the one we sealed after the flood in '98. Ruth, still seated in the interview room with Ben at her feet and her hands folded like a woman waiting for her prescription to be filled, looked through the glass window with eyes so calm it made the younger officers uneasy, as if they'd accidentally arrested the librarian and were only now realizing she might be someone else entirely. When the sheriff entered the room, he didn't start with questions, not at first, because you don't interrogate a woman who once brought your mother a blueberry cobbler the day she came back from chemotherapy. No, you ease in like an old truck on gravel. He sat down across from her, leaned back with a long sigh that came from somewhere deep in his spine, and said, "You still remember how to bypass a Honeywell 4200 keypad? That thing was discontinued in '94. Ruth gave the faintest nod, just enough to answer, but not so much as to gloat. Outside, the town was asleep beneath the soft hush of Iowa wind pressing against window panes, and inside that small-town sheriff's office, a much older truth was waking up from the place it had been buried for decades. The sheriff stood again, paced for a moment, and said, "Back in '89, someone broke into a motel off Route 34, didn't take $1, but unlocked a room holding a girl that had been missing for 3 weeks. There were no prints, no witnesses. And the door was picked clean like a prayer answered." He turned toward Ruth, who didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept her hands folded as Ben raised his head and let out a low, almost musical breath, the kind dogs make when they know the moment matters. "I always figured whoever did that," the sheriff continued, "knew the dark well enough to move through it without ever leaving footprints behind. And now I find you sitting here, confessing like a woman who's been through this dance more than once." Ruth spoke softly, but her voice carried weight, like a stone placed gently on a grave. "You remember the child, but you never asked who unlocked the back gate at the county shelter in the summer of '92. The same night 4 teenagers disappeared from the juvenile wing." Eli Walker paused, stared, then laughed, but it wasn't a joyful sound, more like a dry cough from somewhere sorrowful, then said, "I always chalked that up to a clerical error, blamed it on a rookie guard named Simmons who was too nervous to keep his pants up, let alone a logbook straight." Then Ruth did something no one expected. She pulled a small cloth-wrapped bundle from her pocket, placed it on the table, and slowly unfolded it to reveal a rusted keyring with labels written in faded marker. "Storage Shed B, Main Wing Lock 1. Patrol Entry Backup. I kept them," she said, "not because I plan to use them again, but because sometimes a symbol keeps a story from being forgotten." Ben stood, walked to the sheriff, and leaned his head against the man's thigh with a familiarity that made Eli look down in surprise, as if recognizing a veteran from a war they'd both served in but never spoke about. Upstairs, the archive room hadn't been touched in years, smelled like paper and regret, and when the young deputy finally forced the lock, the dust fell like old secrets out of a shaking hand. Box after box lined the shelves, cold cases, forgotten files, unclosed tabs from years when paperwork vanished under the weight of larger headlines. In one of the boxes marked Miscellaneous, 1980 to 1990, the sheriff found a photo, yellowed at the edges, of a woman guiding 2 barefoot boys into a van while an unknown hand held the door open from the shadows. "Funny thing," Eli said aloud, still holding the picture, "those kids turned up at a church in Minnesota under fake names, and not a soul ever figured out who got in there." Back at the house, Haley sat cross-legged on Ruth's old recliner, flipping through a worn scrapbook filled with old church newsletters, faded recipes, and a photo of Ruth holding a boy she didn't recognize, with eyes just like hers and a dog beside them that looked like a younger version of Ben. She turned to the last page where, hidden in an envelope taped to the back cover, she found a newspaper clipping from 1979 about a woman arrested for unauthorized access to federal property, but the article ended with an odd footnote. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence. Woman declined to comment. Haley stared at the photo, at the clipped article, at the dog now sleeping on Ruth's quilted rug, and asked aloud to no one in particular, "What kind of life did you live before you were just my grandmother?" "That's what I aim to find out," Sheriff Eli Walker muttered, the photo trembling slightly in his aging hands, not from fear but from the weight of 1,000 questions that had suddenly found their voice after decades of forced silence. As he sat in that forgotten archive room, with cobwebs draping over old filing cabinets like funeral veils and the yellowed light bulb above him flickering as if deciding whether to reveal or protect, the old lawman felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not suspicion, but reverence, like he'd just discovered a name etched into the foundation of the town that no one had ever spoken aloud. He laid the photograph down on the desk carefully, as one might handle a piece of sacred history, then turned to the young deputy standing behind him, wide-eyed and speechless, and said, "Go ask Ruth MacNelly where she learned to pick government locks before her arthritis set in." Back downstairs, Ruth was seated exactly as she had been when he left, straight-backed, hands still, like she'd never moved an inch, but her eyes told a different story, because they had shifted, grown distant, as if watching something the rest of them couldn't see. Eli walked into the room slower than before, not out of fatigue, but out of respect, the kind that comes when you realize the person you thought you knew had lived a second life behind a wall you never noticed. He didn't sit this time, just stood beside the glass, holding the photograph between two fingers, and when he showed it to her, Ruth looked at it for all of 3 seconds before gently closing her eyes and whispering, "That was Fargo, summer of '84. The boys were twins, one with a bad knee, the other afraid of sirens." The young deputy, who hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes, leaned against the doorframe with a kind of disbelief that only comes when the world tilts and refuses to tilt back, and asked quietly, "Why would you do all that? And never take credit?" Ruth exhaled through her nose, slowly, as if the question itself had been aging in her chest for years, then said, "Because some work only matters if nobody claps when it's done, and because safety, real safety, dies in the spotlight." The room went quiet again, save for the soft breathing of Ben, who shifted his weight and rested his chin on Ruth's boot, his eyes locked on the sheriff like he, too, was waiting for something important to happen. That night, as Ruth remained in holding, though not in cuffs, not under force, just under watch, the sheriff drove home with the photograph still on his dashboard, headlights cutting through the familiar backroads like old memories returning from exile. When he pulled into his gravel driveway, his wife, Eileen, who had once sung beside Ruth in the church choir and always called her the only alto with perfect pitch, met him at the porch with a look that wasn't just concern, it was knowing. "She told you something," Eileen said, not asked, and when Eli nodded, she followed him inside, brewed a pot of weak coffee the way he liked it since his ulcer came on, and finally broke the silence with a sentence that cracked the air like a hymn at sunrise. "She saved me once," she said, looking down at her hands, as if they still remembered the way the doorknob turned that night, "but I didn't know it was her until right now." Eli looked up, more curious than shocked, and waited. "I was 17, Eileen continued, working nights at that bus depot outside Des Moines. Thought I was in love with a man who wore cologne like armor and had a grin that could fool a priest." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes shimmered slightly, like someone walking barefoot over glass and pretending not to feel the cut. "He followed me to the back lot one night, drunk, angry, and I thought that was the end," she said. But then a woman appeared out of nowhere, short hair, wore a denim jacket and gloves, and had a dog with her that looked like a shadow with teeth. Eli blinked, leaned forward, and said softly, "Was his name Ben?" Eileen nodded. That woman grabbed the man by the collar, pressed something cold against his ribs, I think it was a tire iron, and told him, in a voice colder than the air in January, that if he ever came near me again, he'd wake up tied to his own bumper. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind that only old women wear when they remember what it cost to be young. And then she was gone, Eileen finished, before I could even ask her name. That night, the sheriff didn't sleep, not because of fear or guilt, but because he realized the stories he thought were his to tell were just side notes in someone else's book. Meanwhile, back at the house, Haley was still wide awake, the photo of the young Ruth in her lap, the newspaper clipping beside it, and a question in her heart that had grown louder with every breath. "What else has she never told me?" "How many people have you saved, ma'am?" the young deputy asked, and though his voice barely broke the quiet, the question rippled through the air like a hymn whispered into a cathedral. Ruth didn't answer right away, not because she was buying time or trying to withhold the truth, but because certain questions, especially ones wrapped in memory and blood and consequence, require a pause, not for drama, but for dignity. Outside the station, the early morning fog was beginning to drift away, leaving the streets damp and shining like silver threads sewn across the town's modest patchwork of homes, stores, and silent front porches. She looked at Deputy Rayner the way a grandmother might look at a grandson asking where the family Bible came from, tender, yet edged with something deeper, something earned over decades of choices no one else dared to make. "I never kept count," she said finally, her voice low but steady, "because if I had, I would have started deciding who was worth saving and who wasn't, and that, son, is a road that don't lead anywhere holy." The young man swallowed hard, nodding slowly, but he didn't look away, and Ruth saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in law enforcement since the late 70s, a willingness to listen without rushing the silence. She leaned back in the metal chair, hands still folded, and stared at the clock on the wall as if waiting for it to strike some unseen hour, then continued, "But I do remember a few faces, mostly the ones that shouldn't have survived but did. Because someone was foolish enough to help when it wasn't smart, wasn't legal, and sure as hell wasn't easy." She told him about Eva, a young mother hiding from a man who wore his badge like a weapon and bruised her ribs so often she could no longer feel the difference between pain and silence. "I broke into that man's house one night while he was out drinking, copied his journals, took photos of bruises he bragged about in his own handwriting, and mailed them to 3 newspapers and 2 judges," she said, her voice calm, her words slow and deliberate, like the passing of a clock that doesn't tick but still keeps perfect time. Ruth never told Eva what she'd done, but she remembered seeing the headline 3 weeks later, and how the man turned in his badge the same day the custody ruling came through. "And then there was Darnell," she said, her tone softening, 12 years old, smarter than most adults, but living on the streets after his mother died and his uncle started using him as a courier for meth. She found him sleeping behind the post office in Cedar Rapids, face swollen, shoes missing, holding a worn paperback copy of Hatchet like it was a piece of armor. "I paid a woman I trusted to say he was hers, and I changed his school records with a typewriter and a jar of whiteout," she said, her hands tightening slightly as she recalled the memory. "And today that boy runs a community center in Ohio that feeds more kids than I've ever baked pies for." Deputy Rayner leaned back against the wall, overwhelmed but unable to stop listening, and Ruth could tell by the look on his face that something was stirring inside him, not just curiosity, but a kind of quiet reckoning. And just as the air in the room seemed to settle, like dust finding its way back to the furniture, another unexpected knock rattled the front door of the station. The sheriff, still dressed in the same shirt he'd worn the night before, opened it to find a woman standing with her hand resting on the head of a young girl, maybe 9, maybe 10, both wearing matching hand-knit scarves that someone had taken time to make with care. "I heard Ruth was here," the woman said, her voice shaking slightly, "and I just wanted to say thank you, because I never got the chance before." The girl looked up at the sheriff, then peeked past him, spotting the dog lying at Ruth's feet through the hallway glass. "Is that Ben?" she whispered, with the wonder of someone who'd heard stories about a mythical creature and just found out he was real. Ruth stood then, slowly, and the way she looked at that girl, gentle, unwavering, and somehow familiar, told everyone in that station that something much larger had just walked through the door. No one asked for details. No one needed them. But later, as the woman and child walked back to their car, the sheriff turned to Ruth and said, "That makes 3 today alone. And I have a feeling we're only at the beginning." Ruth didn't argue. She just sat back down, smoothed her skirt with one hand, and replied, "Most stories don't end when people stop talking about them. They just wait for someone to start listening again." Back at the house, Haley stood in front of the attic door, hand resting on the knob, heart pounding with the weight of everything unsaid. She whispered to the silence, as though speaking through time, "What's hidden up there, Grandma? What haven't you told me yet?" "She said you'd come looking," the voice behind Haley said, soft and familiar, like a radio playing old gospel music from another room. Haley turned slowly, heart thudding in her chest like a second-hand clock trying to find its rhythm, only to see Pastor Miriam standing in the hallway below, still wearing her church coat and holding a manila folder like it was something sacred. "I told her this day would come," the pastor said gently, stepping into the attic with a grace that belied her bad knee, "though I admit, I thought it would take you longer to ask the right question." Haley blinked, her flashlight beam dancing across dust-covered boxes, quilted trunks, and an old steamer chest with 3 brass latches and a leather handle worn to threads. "I didn't even know she had anything up here," Haley whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, I just felt like something was calling. Pastor Miriam smiled, that knowing smile only people who've seen too much and survived it can wear, the kind that says you don't always need proof when your gut already knows the truth. She kept it quiet not because she was ashamed, the pastor said, settling onto an old rocking chair with a wheeze of wooden memory, but because if people knew the whole story, they might try to rewrite it to make themselves feel safer. Haley knelt beside the chest, her fingers trembling as she undid the first latch, the metal creaking with a groan that sounded like time itself reluctantly giving way. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen and newsprint yellowed with age, were artifacts that felt more like echoes than objects. A Polaroid camera with the name Ruthie etched on the side, a stack of forged IDs bound by twine, a lock-picking kit folded neatly in a cloth satchel, and a Bible with half the pages hollowed out to hold what looked like old cassettes labeled with names and dates. "What is all this?" Haley asked, her voice caught somewhere between awe and fear, like she'd stumbled across the bones of a legend she thought was just bedtime fiction. Pastor Miriam set the folder on her lap, opened it carefully, and removed a single page, a list of addresses and code names, each one marked with a different colored dot, each one circled in blue ink by the same steady hand. "These," she said, "are the people your grandmother helped disappear, people who were running from more than just danger. They were running from systems that were never meant to protect them in the first place." Haley looked back at the chest, pulled out one of the tapes, and held it up to the light. On it, scribbled in black marker, were the words, "Arizona, July 87. Record only if gone." "Gone?" Haley asked, her voice barely audible, as if she already knew the answer but needed to hear someone say it. Miriam nodded slowly, folding her hands over the folder, her eyes clouding just slightly with memory. "Your grandmother always made two plans, one for saving people, and one for when she knew she wouldn't make it back," she said, the truth settling in the room like dust disturbed by footsteps in a forgotten church. There was something else in the chest, a sealed envelope marked, "For Haley, only when you ask." Haley stared at it for a long while, afraid to open it, afraid not to, afraid of what it might confirm. And while she stared, Miriam continued, voice as steady as Sunday scripture, "Ruth wasn't just a woman who baked pies and read to children. She was the last remnant of a network most folks thought disappeared after the Cold War ended." Haley finally took the envelope, ran her fingers across the seal like she was touching her grandmother's face, and opened it slowly. Inside, on a single sheet of stationery in her grandmother's unmistakable script, were just 4 lines. "What you choose to carry is yours now. The weight is not punishment, it is purpose. I never looked for thanks, only courage. And if you're reading this, I know you have enough." Haley's hands trembled, her throat tightened, and suddenly the full weight of her grandmother's choice, to take the fall, to protect her, crashed down like a church bell in a storm. She pressed the letter to her chest, let herself cry for the first time in weeks, not from guilt or shame, but from the sudden understanding that love, the real kind, often walks in silence and carries things no one else dares to touch. Downstairs, Ben stirred from his place by the hearth, looked up the staircase, and let out a low huff, as if he, too, had been waiting for this moment. And just before Haley could speak again, the phone rang, a landline with a ringer so old it still sounded like a bell, and on the other end was the voice of Sheriff Eli Walker. "She's agreed to speak," he said, without waiting for hello. "But only to you, Haley." She said the story has to end the way it began, quiet, with family. Haley gripped the receiver, eyes still wet, voice calm but steady now, like someone who'd finally found her footing after years of slipping. "What story?" she asked. "The one you were born into," Ruth said, her voice calm and low, like a hymn remembered not for its melody but its meaning. She didn't look at Haley right away, not out of coldness, but because there are some truths so deeply embedded in the fabric of a person's soul, they require silence to rise, like warm bread needing time to prove it's real. Haley sat across from her now, not as a granddaughter pleading for answers, but as a woman finally ready to inherit a burden that didn't ask permission before settling into her life like a shadow that refused to leave. Ben, curled beside Ruth's chair like a sentinel carved out of memory and fur, lifted his head ever so slightly when Haley entered, his eyes meeting hers with a familiarity that felt older than her childhood, older even than her grief. "This story," Ruth began slowly, folding her hands on the table like she was back in the church hall after service, preparing to read minutes from a forgotten meeting, "was never about me, or the people I helped, or the names on those tapes you found in the attic. It was always about legacy, about what gets passed on when no one else is willing to carry it." Haley didn't interrupt. There was something different in Ruth now, not weaker, not defeated, but stripped down, like weathered by storms but still sturdy enough to hold weight without splintering. You were born in the spring of 2005, Ruth continued, her voice steady but shaded with something else now, regret maybe, or sorrow, or perhaps just the bone-deep ache of remembrance. Your mama, God rest her, had no business carrying a child into the mess she'd stumbled into, but she did anyway because she was stubborn like her mother and twice as reckless. Haley's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She knew the stories people told, that her mother had overdosed when Haley was 7, that Ruth had stepped in without question and raised her without ever using the word sacrifice. But now, something older and more dangerous was creeping beneath the surface, like an undertow pulling the sand out from beneath her feet. Before you were born, Ruth said, her gaze now locked on Haley's, her voice quiet but clear, your mama got mixed up with a man named Clarence Boone, a name I've never said out loud to anyone in this town. Because to say his name was to invite the kind of trouble that don't knock before it enters. Haley felt her blood turn cold. Clarence Boone wasn't a name she recognized from any photo album or obituary, but there was something in the way Ruth said it that made her feel like she'd just stepped into a room that had been locked for decades. He ran women like freight, Ruth said, her jaw tightening. Girls too young to know what they were being promised. Boys too scared to run. He trafficked people the way some folks trade livestock, clean hands, clean ledgers, dirty heart. And your mama, she was his favorite bird in a cage. Haley gasped, then covered her mouth, tears rising not from shock but from the terrible realization that her mother's silence hadn't been ignorance, it had been protection. She tried to get out, Ruth said, her voice softer now, like the light at the end of a long hallway. She came to me late one night, bleeding from the lip and shaking like a newborn foal. She told me she was pregnant, told me Boone didn't know, told me she needed a way out. Haley reached across the table now, not to grab Ruth's hands, but to steady her own. I took her in, Ruth said, her voice growing firmer, and I did what I've done since 1971. I made her disappear. Gave her a new name, a new address, a new hope. But Boone had eyes in places you don't expect, not just among criminals, but inside uniforms and behind pulpits. You found her. There was silence again, but it wasn't empty, it was thick, like the air before a storm, filled with things too heavy to move but too sacred to leave untouched. He didn't kill her, Ruth said, the words falling like stones, but he broke something inside her that never healed. And when she passed, I made 2 promises, one to her, and one to you. I promised her I'd raise you safe. And I promised you'd never have to know the cage she escaped from unless the day came when you needed to carry the key. Haley wiped her face, tears steady now, no longer falling in protest, but in gratitude for truth, for clarity, for the map of pain that explained her own story in ways no one had dared show her before. Why me? She whispered, barely able to say it. Why did she think I could carry that key? Because you have her fire, and my hands, Ruth said, not with pride or flattery, but with the certainty of a woman who had lived too long to believe in accidents. Her voice, worn but steady, filled the small visiting room like an organ in an empty chapel, every word resonating with the soft ache of legacy passed down not by blood alone, but by choice and will and unspoken vows whispered between generations. Haley lowered her gaze for a moment, as if unsure whether she had earned the right to carry what had been left in her lap, like a bundle of old linens that, when unfolded, revealed not softness, but scars. I remember when you were just a child, Ruth continued, her fingers slowly tracing the edge of the table like a seamstress recalling the feel of fabric now long out of fashion. And I'd catch you hiding under the pews at church, drawing shapes on the wood with your finger. Always watching without being seen, always listening when no one thought to hush their voices. Ben shifted beside her chair, ears flicking once, sensing the charge in the air, the same way he once had in the years when a creak on a floorboard might have meant a life or a bullet. You watched, Ruth said, her voice taking on the rhythm of memory, but you also waited, and that's the difference between those who run toward danger out of impulse, and those who walk into fire only when someone's trapped on the other side. Haley looked up then, her voice trembling, but not with fear, with something deeper, something forged in the furnace of recent days. I'm not her, she whispered, and I'm not you. So what am I supposed to do with all this? Ruth smiled, not wide, not soft, but with a gravity that made the light in the room feel warmer somehow, like sunlight through old curtains. You carry it for now, she said, not forever, not alone, but long enough to decide what kind of world you want to leave behind you. The room fell into a hush again, as if time itself had taken a deep breath, letting the words settle into the bones of the floorboards. Then Ruth's tone shifted slightly, deeper now, darker, as if they were leaving the surface of the past and descending into something colder, hidden beneath it. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, leaning in ever so slightly, "and I need you to hear it the way a soldier hears a final order, not to obey it blindly, but to understand why it must be given." Haley nodded, suddenly aware that whatever came next would be different from everything that came before, like the stillness before a verdict is read. "Clarence Boone is still alive," Ruth said, the words falling with the dull weight of an iron key dropped on stone. "He vanished for a while, changed names, moved west, resurfaced in Nevada under the name Boyd Coulter. But 2 weeks ago, someone saw him in Nebraska, near Kearney, asking questions about a girl named Haley MacNelly." Haley blinked, the chair beneath her suddenly too small, the air too still. "He's looking for me?" she asked, her voice more curious than afraid, as if her spirit had grown teeth in the span of a single sentence. Ruth nodded. "And he won't stop until he either finds you or believes you're gone for good. Which is why," she continued, sliding a folded map across the table, "you're going to disappear for a little while." Haley shook her head instinctively, the fire in her bones rising, resisting the idea of vanishing just when truth had finally started to show its face. "I'm not running," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not when I finally know who I am. Not when I have this fire you say I got." Ruth smiled again, this time with something close to pride. "I didn't say you were running," she said. "I said you were going to disappear. There's a difference, and knowing that difference is what kept me alive when the law couldn't tell saints from criminals." The map had 5 circles drawn on it, each in red ink, each next to a number that wasn't an address, but a year. Haley traced the first with her finger. "What are these?" she asked, her voice a whisper again. Ruth sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and replied, "Places where Boone made people vanish, and where someone else made them reappear." Haley looked up, the map still in her hand, the fire now joined by something sharper, purpose. "What happened to the others?" she asked. "Some were saved, and some were never meant to be," Ruth said, and her words didn't echo so much as they lingered, like incense from an old funeral, curling into the corners of the room where light rarely touched. Her voice wasn't bitter, and it wasn't broken. It simply carried the wear of someone who had learned the difference between being a rescuer and being a witness, between pulling people from the fire and accepting that some already lived inside it. Haley didn't respond right away. She sat there tracing one of the years on the map, 1989, underlined twice, wondering what story lay beneath that red circle, wondering how many names had been forgotten not by accident, but by design. "Back then," Ruth said quietly, "I believed I could get to everyone before it was too late, like the hands of a clock chasing the future, always thinking they were faster than fate." She turned slightly, gazing past Haley toward the window, where morning light was just beginning to stretch itself across the tiled floor like an old cat reclaiming its space. "In 1989, I found a girl named Loretta Quinn in a halfway house outside St. Paul," she continued, her words moving slowly now, like someone walking barefoot across cold ground, and she had the kind of eyes that looked through people, not at them. Like she'd seen things that made her doubt what kindness even felt like anymore. Haley said nothing, only listened. "She had been passed between more hands than a deck of bad cards," Ruth continued, "and by the time I got to her, she wasn't looking to be saved, she was looking to disappear, like smoke from a candle that's already burned too long." There was a long pause, the kind filled with the silence of choices that still wake a person in the middle of the night. "I tried," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Lord knows I tried. Gave her a new name, found her a safe house, even moved her across state lines using a trucker who owed me a favor and never asked why." Haley leaned forward, her elbows on the table now, her eyes fixed not on Ruth but on the space between them, as if that invisible stretch of air held every untold story she was still trying to understand. "But 2 weeks later," Ruth said, her voice steadying again, "I got word she'd gone back. Not because she wanted the pain, but because, sometimes, pain is the only home a person knows." She paused again, then turned toward Haley. "I've lived long enough to know that some folks aren't waiting for a door to be opened, they're just waiting to know someone knocked," she said. "And Loretta, God rest her, never answered that knock." Haley breathed deeply, holding back the tears that now pressed gently against her throat, not as sorrow but as respect for the weight her grandmother had carried and the one she'd tried, again and again, to lift. "You still tried," Haley said, almost to herself, "even when you knew they might not let themselves be saved." Ruth gave a slow nod, her hands resting in her lap like folded pages of a book nearly finished. "That's the difference between saving someone and giving them the tools to save themselves," she replied. "One leaves you with empty hands. The other leaves you with hope. Outside, a wind had begun to rise, gently rustling the dried leaves along the sidewalk. That soft rattle like bones speaking from beneath the ground, reminders of seasons past and those yet to come. Just then, the door to the visiting room cracked open, and Sheriff Eli Walker stepped inside, holding a piece of paper with an expression that suggested it carried more weight than its size would suggest. "We just got a call," he said, handing the paper to Ruth without a word of explanation. Someone matching Boone's description was seen in Omaha, asking questions about church directories and family reunions. Ruth read the note slowly, then folded it once and slid it into her pocket without ceremony. "He's tracing bloodlines now," she said. "Means he's getting close to realizing she didn't die in that trailer like he thought." Haley's heart began to pound again, but this time not from fear. This time, it was something colder, sharper, and more focused. "I won't hide," she said. "You won't need to," Ruth replied. "But you will need to go where others can't." Sheriff Walker looked between the two women, then said, "I can assign a deputy to tail him if he crosses into Iowa. But we both know that might not matter." "It won't," Ruth said, standing now with the help of the table, her body slower than it once was but her presence just as commanding. "Because Boone doesn't fear men with badges, he fears women with memory." She turned to Haley, the lines on her face deep with time, but her eyes burning like embers beneath ash. "It's time you met someone," she said softly. "A name you've never heard, but a name you'll need if you're going to stop him." Haley tilted her head slightly, the edge of a question already forming. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. "The woman who trained me," Ruth said, and there was a stillness in the room that felt almost like reverence, like someone had just uttered the name of a saint without needing to say the name at all. Haley blinked slowly, uncertain whether to ask a follow-up or simply wait for the weight of the moment to settle itself properly in her chest, because she had learned that when Ruth MacNelly paused, it wasn't from forgetfulness. It was from the sheer gravity of the truth about to be spoken. "She wasn't a teacher in any ordinary sense," Ruth continued, easing herself back down into the wooden chair with the care of someone who knew every creak it had ever made, "and she didn't come into my life gently, like a grandmother with warm biscuits and soft advice. Instead, she arrived like a sudden change in weather, the kind that turns a picnic into a search for shelter." Haley leaned forward slightly, hands clasped tight in her lap, as if holding them together might keep her from shaking apart at the seams. "Her name was Etta Vaughn," Ruth said, the syllables falling into the room like stones into a still pond, and though they were simple words, they echoed like something ancient and rooted. "She ran a safe house out of a broken-down funeral parlor in the outskirts of Tulsa," Ruth went on, her eyes distant now, staring through the walls as if they had turned to glass. From the outside, it looked like a place where the dead were laid to rest with a hymn and a handshake, but in truth, it was a place where the living were reborn quietly, without ceremony, with new names and new hope stitched into the lining of donated clothes. Haley could feel something rising inside her, something between admiration and grief. Because every story Ruth told now was a reminder that the woman who had made tea and tucked her in with stories of angels and fireflies had also walked through darker valleys than she had ever imagined. "I met her in '74, Ruth said, her voice softer now, the way old soldiers speak of the first time they saw battle. "She found me after I'd fled Missouri with a girl named Shonda who'd been locked in a church basement by a man pretending to be God." Haley inhaled sharply, her breath catching like a cold wind across a tightrope, but Ruth didn't stop. "Etta didn't ask questions," she said. "She just took us in, fed us, cleaned the blood off Shonda's feet, and then handed me a ledger full of names, dates, and coordinates, and told me if I wasn't willing to help others get out, I'd better leave before dawn." Ben stirred at Ruth's feet then, as if even the memory of that woman had a scent only he recognized, and Haley found herself wondering what parts of her grandmother's life he had witnessed without ever having words to share them. "For 3 years, I ran missions for Etta," Ruth said, her voice strengthening now. "She taught me how to disable locks without breaking them, how to lie without blinking, how to read a man's posture better than his words, and, most of all, how to decide when to act and when to disappear." Haley sat back slowly, overwhelmed but steady, like a ship battered by waves but not capsized. "Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" she asked, her voice trembling with the quiet ache of someone realizing their entire family tree had been watered with secrets. "Because Etta made me swear," Ruth answered, "that no one would know her name until the day came when silence was no longer protection, but a prison." The sheriff, standing just outside the doorway with a look on his face that suggested he'd stopped pretending to be surprised a long time ago, cleared his throat gently. "We ran that name you gave us," he said, stepping forward and placing a printout on the table, And it turns out Etta Vaughn passed away 4 years ago in a retirement home outside Lincoln, Nebraska. No family, no visitors, but in her file, under emergency contacts, there was one line written by hand. He turned the paper so Ruth and Haley could see it clearly. It read, "If anything happens to me, find Ruth. She knows what to do." Ruth read it once, then twice, then folded the paper as carefully as a letter from a friend long gone, and placed it over her heart. "She left something behind," Ruth said quietly. "A key. And not the kind that fits indoors, but the kind that opens the last chapter." Haley's pulse quickened again, her mind racing toward questions she didn't yet have the language to ask, and before she could stop herself, she said, "What does the key open?" "The only place Clarence Boone can still be stopped," Ruth said, her voice low and certain, as if the answer had been waiting patiently beneath her tongue for the better part of 30 years, untouched by doubt, unchanged by time. For a moment, the room itself seemed still, no creak from the walls, no wind tapping the window glass, not even a rustle from Ben, whose head now rested across Ruth's foot like he was bracing for something sacred to be said. Haley looked at her grandmother with eyes that no longer belonged to a child, nor even to a young woman chasing answers in the dark, but to someone who finally understood the weight of silence, the burden of memory, and the fire it takes to carry both forward. "There's a place," Ruth began slowly, each word spoken like it had been stored in a vault carved into the marrow of her bones, just outside of Fort Dodge, an old shelter built in the 1960s. Back when women had nowhere to run but still found the courage to do it anyway. She leaned forward now, her elbows resting gently on the table as if laying down offerings instead of arms. "Most folks believe it shut down in 1982 after a fire burned part of the north wing," she continued. "But the truth is, it was never about the building. It was about the tunnel beneath it. A hollow passage carved by the same hands that once dug cellars to hide bottles during Prohibition and people during the worst of the raids." Haley blinked slowly, listening with every inch of her being, because she could feel that the final piece of the story, the piece Ruth had buried the deepest, was now rising into the light like an old hymn finally remembered. "That tunnel," Ruth said, "leads to a holding room built beneath the kitchen, concrete walls, one entry point, one exit, and a chain-coded lock that only 2 people on this earth still know how to open." Haley spoke for the first time in minutes, her voice soft and tight, like a rope holding up the last piece of a bridge. "Who's the second person?" she asked, though deep down, something already told her the answer. Ruth didn't smile, and she didn't flinch, she just nodded slowly. "You," she said. "Or rather, you will be." The sheriff shifted his weight behind them, clearing his throat not out of impatience, but out of sheer disbelief that his life had somehow landed him inside a story he hadn't realized was still unfolding around him. "I've left instructions," Ruth continued, "to be transferred to county medical at noon tomorrow for a routine exam. Boone will be watching the court. He won't expect movement until sentencing." Haley's brow furrowed, the full weight of the plan beginning to dawn like sunrise after a long, frozen night. "You're baiting him," she whispered, voice edged with fear and awe. Ruth nodded once, the motion so small and certain that it carried more authority than a judge's gavel. "He's followed shadows his whole life, convinced that if he just stays in the dark long enough, he can outrun the light," Ruth said. "But some lights don't chase. They wait." Haley opened the map again, the one with the red circles, and saw now, in the bottom corner, a 6th location circled in black. "I need to go there," she said. Ruth reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a key, not a metaphorical one, not a whispered promise, but a real iron key with initials etched in its head, EV. "This opens the door to the holding room," she said. "And if he comes after me, if he follows me into that tunnel, you'll be on the other side, waiting, not to kill him, not to punish, but to end it where it began." The sheriff, who had seen enough in his years to know when words could no longer carry the moment, simply nodded and stepped aside. That night, under cover of fog and silence, Ruth was transferred under the guise of medical evaluation, and Haley, now wearing a borrowed deputy jacket and a new nameplate, headed north with Ben in the passenger seat and a key around her neck. The shelter stood exactly as Ruth had described it, hollowed by time, kissed by fire, but not broken. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of ash and rain, and beneath a loose panel behind the pantry, the entrance to the tunnel waited like a final confession. Haley descended slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, and when she reached the end, she found the room Ruth had spoken of, cold, silent, bare but for a single chair, a chain, and a metal bar across the door. She waited there, not knowing if it would be 10 minutes or 10 hours, but never doubting that Ruth's plan would unfold exactly as she'd envisioned, because Ruth didn't act out of hope or luck. She acted out of certainty, the kind forged in fire, sharpened by loss, and softened only by love. And then, footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Coming through the tunnel like thunder on old wooden floors. Haley braced herself, every breath now a prayer, not for safety, but for truth. And when the door opened and the silhouette stepped into the room, she saw his face for the first time. Clarence Boone. Older now, but with the same hunger in his eyes, the same rot beneath the charm. But before he could speak, the door behind him slammed shut, locked tight by a sheriff's hand on the other side. And Ruth's voice echoed through the speaker from the observation window above, calm as ever. You always liked cages, Clarence. Now you finally have one of your own. Haley stood tall then, no longer trembling, no longer unsure. Because the story, her story, was never just about a crime, or a confession, or even a rescue. It was about legacy, and about knowing when to step forward, not because you're ready, but because someone trusted you enough to believe you would be. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.